Hey everybody, Justin here.
Eric here.
Yep, both of us
Yep.
together once again.
Uh, Once again.
We do this every 6 p.m. Eastern Time for Thursdays. Uh, we do Sonic Boom Live, which is our weekly-ish talk show where we talk to each other about the latest game news and what's going on in the game industry. Um, Next week we will be off. We will be at a conference, so neither of us can do it. But we will give you the latest tidbits from this week, and we actually got some pretty interesting ones. One's a continuation on what we were talking about last week, and then two other stories, kind of major developments that I think kind of touch on some other shifts happening in the game industry. Um, Let's see. Well, I guess to recap, like I said, we're Sonic Boom Live every 6 p.m. Eastern Time Thursday. Streamed on YouTube. We used to do Twitch and YouTube, but Twitch wasn't really doing anything for us. So on YouTube, anyways. Also, Twitch might be dying. We'll see. So
Wait, go on. What's this?
yeah, Twitch has been changing its payment structures, and a lot of that has been changing, which has been degrading and sort of eroding a lot of their core streamers, and they're moving away from it towards YouTube, or in favor of other streaming platforms. So
Yeah, I don't know what the if Twitch. I don't recall Twitch having ads the way that YouTube does.
they do ads. They structure them differently, but basically their payment system is like considerably less than YouTube's. Plus their viewership is very specific to gaming, so I guess
Yeah.
discoverability is better on Twitch's platform, but YouTube offers a better payment structure for people who are successful there. So
Yeah.
Twitch may be becoming a bit more niche.
All right.
Regardless, we no longer stream there.
They lost us.
Yeah, they lost
Uh,
us a while ago. Not like not like we were demanding an audience by any means, but
hey,
yeah,
every little bit.
every little bit,
That's
like right,
5,000 paper cuts, right?
which they may be having far greater than 5,000 paper cuts.
Yeah.
Either way, YouTube.com. If you like the content, you can check us out on YouTube.com, where you're probably watching this right now. But we have a bunch of other videos that you can check out on our channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please like the videos that you find interesting. It tells us what people enjoy. You can also subscribe to our channel where you get notifications when we go live, which is every Thursday at 6 p.m. And periodically we'll release other videos, mostly in the form of tutorials for our Choreographer product, which you can find linked at the bottom of every description in all of our videos. So let's get on to the recap, onto the latest game industry news. Eric, do you want to recap those?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's go over what we're covering today. We're going to go over some Silent Hill announcements. This is stuff that has made headlines in the game industry because, I don't know, something like 10-ish years ago, the Konami, the publisher of the original publisher and developer of the Silent Hill series, said they were backing away from major console games with a very small selection of exceptions.
Yeah,
And
most of their soccer titles.
yeah, yep. Sports, the standard sports stuff. Winning 11 for them is huge.
Yep.
You know, so they are somewhat signaling a return, maybe with this. We'll see. We're going to discuss that. The second thing we're going to discuss is that Comcast has canceled the G4 revival. G4 TV specifically. Those of you, some of you may recall, at least in the States, there was a TV channel. I think it basically started with satellite, like it was one of those satellite or premium package. What were they called? Cable
Stations. Yeah.
cable stations. Yeah, you had to pay extra for it. And in this case, Comcast was going to bring it back, but they appear to be reversing that. So we'll give that a little.
A little bit more than reversal, I'd say. They pulled the plug hard. So
Yeah, we'll talk
in a bit of a dubious way at that. So
Oh yeah, yeah. The classic, just rip the Band-Aid right off, like all at one go.
yeah, yeah.
So the third the third topic we're going to touch on this week is that it's sort of a follow-up to a topic that we hit last week, which was the one with Microsoft responses from the CMA in the UK and some commission in the European government to the Microsoft's buyout of Activision Blizzard. Microsoft has since posted a response to the CMA's arguments, and we're going to take a look into what they said and what that might mean going forward for that topic.
And I should also remind people that, like, this is normal. Like, these regulatory bodies have to review these sort of purchases. If it's less questionable, they go through quickly. But in this case, they're large companies buying other large companies, so they get more scrutiny than normal. And as we've been covering in like past episodes where we've seen the Brazilian regulatory committee like also doing the same thing, Microsoft is required to provide a response, a very lawyery response, that makes counter arguments as to why what they're doing is perfectly fine. So what's interesting about this is that these like responses play two roles. One is which it's like a public argument that has to be public. So you're seeing a response from Microsoft that has to respond to these specific complaints, but they also know it's going into their PR campaign. So they're rewarded in ways that are both aware of that people are going to be reading it and reporting on it, and that they have to actually provide a specific response to the arguments being made by regulatory bodies. So it's kind of like, I don't know, man behind the curtain stuff that we don't usually get to see. Usually you don't see these sort of responses from Microsoft. So this is all being aired in public. We get the opportunity to read it. We get to learn more details about stuff we may not have heard before. And it gives us some insight into the way Microsoft is positioning and strategizing and seeing their latest acquisitions. So let's, I guess, just jump into it. Do you want to recap Silent Hills, or do you want me to jump in?
Why don't you start with the Silent Hills?
Okay. Yeah. So actually, what's even happening today and what happened yesterday? Silent Hill had this big. Well, actually, let me take a step back. Lately, since COVID and even a bit before that, companies are now like just setting aside time and going like, hey, we're going to be doing this presentation. There's one actually happening right now. It's for Resident Evil, but they had one like a month ago, so I really have no idea what exactly they have more to report on.
Did they have one, or was it that they were featured in Sony's big?
No, they had their own like Capcom showcase where they showed off things like Street Fighter, and they had a whole section on Resident Evil.
That's right.
Where they were showing add-on content to Resident Evil 4 remake, stuff like that. And now they have a Resident Evil specific broadcast that's happening right now that is going over their stuff. But what we're talking about today, because we don't have the foresight to know what Resident Evil is really showing, or like what Capcom's showing off for Resident Evil, I also don't think there's anything we don't already know about. We know there's the remake for Resident Evil 4. We know that there's content being added to Resident Evil Village. Resident Evil 7 and 8 are getting VR updates from Tokyo Game Show that we saw. That's going to work for PlayStation VR 2. There's the Resident Evil show on Netflix that I'm not sure if they're getting a second season, but that was there. And I think they also had an animated like movie or series that was out. I could be wrong about that, but there's no content that we really don't know about. I'm sure that they have some sort of announcement that they want to make, but it should be less thrilling than what Konami did yesterday, which was the Silent Hill showcase. The Konami, who has famously not been making games for quite some time now, has suddenly like come out of the woodwork and is like, hey, we're no longer doing Pachinko exclusively, which is what they have been doing, and like Winning 11. We're actually going to take some of our best franchises, which Konami owns quite a few of, and we're going to revive it with these new announcements. So they had this whole showcase set up. I think it was about 45 minutes long, where they rolled out a like revival of the Silent Hill franchise, which personally excited about because I was a huge fan of the first, second, and third games. After that, it got a little bit not great. But there's some gems here and there, but really like the creme of the crop was like Silent Hill 2, which I think was a pioneer in a lot of game narrative that we hadn't experienced up to that point. Some really smart narrative and really like I don't know. It's a fantastic game. It's the best in the series easily. So they talked about the revival. To start, they showed off that Silent Hill 2, which had long been rumored to be getting a remake by Sony, and was actually at one point rumored to have been purchased by Sony, but that turned out not to be the case. What had actually happened is the Silent Hill franchise was given to Bloober Team, which is a development team that had made stuff like I'm blanking on the name of it. They're horror games. They also did the I'm blanking. I should have written these down. Oh man, that's bad. They had recently done one for Xbox. Right now. Yeah,
I got you back.
It's something Layers of Fear was one, and then the other one was
Layers of Fears and The Medium.
The Medium, that's what it is. So both of those are strong horror content.
They did the Blair Witch game way back in the day too.
Yes.
So horror is they're totally their genre.
Yeah, and they're quite good at it. I think people have a bit mixed, but Layers of Fear was really well received. It's kind of a novel take on survival horror. The Medium is much more in line with Silent Hill, possibly the reason why they were able to go ahead and produce it. They're a European-based developer. This had been rumored before, but it wasn't clear how Sony was going to be related to this. Was Sony going to be publishing and developing? Was Sony buying Silent Hill outright? What was the exact deal? And it turns out, Konami gives the license to Bloober Team to develop the title. Konami will be publisher, and I'm sure have some creative direction. They're also bringing back the original creator of the game and the composer to do new work on the game. So Konami's doing creative direction and getting the original creators to help direct. Bloober Team's doing the development. Sony has paid some unknown sum of money to Konami to make this happen. Unclear exactly how much, but what they get out of it is a 1-year exclusivity on consoles. And that means they'll probably release on Xbox a year after that. And then the PC, it's getting a PC release probably shortly thereafter or day and date. Neither of us know, nor are those details shared, but that's what's happening with Silent Hill. But it will get a full remake. Sorry, where new assets and new development. They're not going to be taking the original engine. It's the Bloober Team is going to be looking at how exactly the original game was made and replicating those in a new engine, which if anybody who played that game a while ago knows that it needs new control schemes, camera work, graphic system. Like, it's just not worth trying to revive as it is.
No, they would have to take the assets and do so much work to them. They can use them as reference and basically take screenshots from the game and say, cool, that's our target. But
yeah, my guess is like get the wireframe work to get like level layout, but I don't know.
There's evidence on the web that it appears I think the second game, the remake of number 2, is going to use Unreal Engine.
Oh, that's
behind the scenes. Yeah.
Not surprising.
No,
where we're at.
But I mean, it's really tough to want to say like let's create our own game engine and have to rebuild all of the pipeline tools that go into making modern, beautiful games that use the latest and greatest technologies from across even color grading, all of that stuff across the various types of rendering you have to do. It's crazy.
And if anybody recalls that game, both the first game and second game were graphically limited, and they used fog as a way to basically hide the fact that their draw distances weren't great.
Silent Hill was PlayStation 1.
Yes.
And Silent Hill 2 was PlayStation 2.
Yes. And an early PS2 game for that matter. That game, like the whole fog system is going to be redone so that it's actually a volumetric system that functions more like actual fog opposed to a window dressing to hide technical faults. Yeah, so the whole thing is getting remade from the ground up, supposedly. Rightfully so, but that does leave a lot of room for where a developer could seriously mess with the what made Silent Hill 2 really good, which is the story, and like art direction. Yeah, fingers crossed. Did you play that game, Eric, or did you just get to hear me talk about how great it was?
I think it was the latter. I played a little bit of the first one.
Okay, yeah.
I played the early parts of the first one.
I see. Well, play the second one. It's a real treat.
Maybe the remake.
Yeah.
I don't have a PS2 to hand right now, and
No.
I'm not super excited to. I don't know. Is that even on the PlayStation Plus top like platinum or whatever?
I would doubt it. I'm all.
Yeah.
I don't know. Who knows? It's up to Konami, and Konami has not been very willing.
Yeah. I mean, to the point where, and we should mention this. There was a demo that was put out for the PlayStation 4 that was supposed to be theoretically in the Silent Hill kind of universe.
And it happened just around the time that Konami's like, "Hey, we're pulling out of making games."
We're done. Yeah, and Konami pulled out so quickly and so hard that they removed that game, which was a free demo that they put on the PlayStation 4 and was absolutely incredible. And they removed it, and apparently, I think Norman Reedus and Guillermo del Toro were both attached to the game that they were trying to build.
They were, yeah.
And Guillermo del Toro came back afterwards and said, like, well, that was a terrible experience. I'm never doing games again. Yeah. Like, because of how poorly Konami handled the cancellation of that game. So, yeah. There's videos of the game has videos online. It was super, super creepy. My hope is that they can capture, and with these new games we're going to cover a little bit more of in a minute, they'll be able to recapture what they showed in PT, because oh boy.
Yeah, I mean, there's some significant qualms about that, but we can discuss when we get into like why is Konami doing this and why now. Yeah. So they showed two other game products that were in the works. Well, actually, no, three other game. Like it's very game strange because they go from being like true games to is this game or is this like cinema
experience?
Yeah. So we have Silent Hill Towerfall, which is I think probably better defined as a game. It's being developed by No Code, but published or like co-published by Annapurna. Annapurna tends to be very selective about who it is that they work with, so presumably No Code and the team at Annapurna see a lot of potential in whatever they're developing. Konami has just basically given the license to both of them to develop this and will take money as publisher. Not a whole lot is known about any of these. It's a new Silent Hill that's going to function more as a normal game. Then we have Silent Hill Ascension, which is going to be developed by Bad Robot. Also, I want to note here, Silent Hill Towerfall. Towerfall is a game that has already existed. Silent Hill Ascension. Ascension was the tag name for God of War 4. That wasn't like the PS4 version, but the one before that. It was God of War Ascension. So they're pulling out names from other games at this point. But Silent Hill Ascension.
Towerfall itself is a multiplayer
like
game
2D
game originally shipped on the Ouya as available on a bunch of like PlayStation.
Remember what the Ouya was?
Kickstarted console.
Kickstarted console. You had one. It lasted for about like 4 months before like we're closing.
Yeah, I actually never had one. This Firehose Games had one. We played it there at lunch.
Oh, yeah.
And it for quite a while.
Oh, you ended up getting it when they released on
PlayStation 4. Yeah.
Well, back to Silent Hill. Silent Hill Ascension.
Yep.
This is the one that's more of an experience. It's traipsing a strange line. It's being developed by Bad Robot, which is J.J. Abrams' production company, normally known for film and not known for games. Behavior, Genvid, and DJ2. Behaviors more in Genvid are more traditional developers, but they specialize in interactive video content. So my guess is the way this is working out is Bad Robot is going to be in charge of production, video production. Behavior and Genvid are going to be responsible for the technology to make an interactive video system. And the way it was described is going to be they're trying to replicate what they've seen on Twitch, where people will live stream something like PT or Silent Hill 2 being played, and the sort of engagement people get from that, except it will be more of intentional in that way. I do not know how this will really work in execution. It seems pretty high concept, but Konami. Go ahead.
It's weird. It's an event. They're billing it as an event.
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess if you just maybe a vote like a choose your own adventure. It seems like it's a Twitch style Twitch TV. Choose your own adventure. That's crowdsourced. So like the audience gets to pick, you have you're in the studio audience where you have a buzzer and you get to pick the red button or the green button to pick which direction you go, except it's all going to do maybe via voting. I think they said some people were going to have sort of individual tokens that allow them to control some specific character or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, either way, this is going to be a brand new concept.
Yeah.
And I will say Konami has been interesting with their Silent Hill franchise. They've allowed Universal, which published, I think, the movie under one of their sub-studios, Universal Studios, to do entirely Silent Hill themed horror park, which they do every Halloween. But one year they did it was like entirely Silent Hill based, where you would see like Pyramid Head was there, as were the nurses, and you'd go from like normal buildings to one that had been like decayed by that like Silent Hill effect. So Konami's been experimental with the Silent Hill franchise before. This seems like a brand new type of experience. No idea if it'll be great or good or just like a failure, but it's definitely an interesting take on their behalf. And then finally they showed Silent Hill F, which is there's not much known about it. It's also like it's being developed by Ryukishi 07, which is
he's the writer.
He's the writer. It's being developed by a Nintendo dev, but all they really showed was a video of some. The other thing that we know is like it takes place, I think, in 1950s, 1960s Japan. So it's a new setting for Silent Hill, as it's usually taken place in this town of Silent Hill, which is somewhere in East Coast or Pacific Northwest Americas. So this is a bit different. They show a lot of mushrooms or cordyceps like growing out of people's bodies, and I think kind of preying on the like what do they call that fear? The fear of holes. Trypophobia, I think.
I'm not sure. It's definitely takes place in Japan. It's takes place in an old time.
They confirmed, that was going to take place in like 60s Japan, I think. Which is briefly the whole thing that we don't know is it's probably going to be published by Konami. It's not going to be it's unlikely this is being developed by Konami, and if it is, it's the first time Konami in this whole thing is actually going to be directly developing something. Which I think we can talk about this a bit more, but it's unclear when it's going to come out, and it's also unclear what exactly the experience is going to be. Is it a straightforward video game, or are they doing something more experimental with this? Presumably, it's like the former and not the latter, but there was really very little detail to go on what exactly Silent Hill F is. It seems far enough out that it could even get canceled if the reception to the other Silent Hills content is not well received. So who knows? And then the other thing that they showed off was Return to Silent Hill, which is this is actually one of the more exciting ones for me. Silent Hill is going back to the movies with the original director and writer of the first one, which is a pretty faithful, if not flawed, reproduction of the contents of Silent Hill 1, the game, in cinema form. Christoph Gans is the one who is leading up the whole thing, and apparently a huge fan of the game. So much so that I guess he was pushing Konami to do a Return to Silent Hill, which would be based off of the second game in large part. So lots of big news, but very strange for Konami to roll out a bunch of game development. What do you think's changed for Konami, and what exactly do you think their approach here is?
Yeah, I think the timing of this felt surprising. It's 2022, and a lot of the stuff that they showed off still seems a little bit early, but they do have some assets for the trailers that they've shown, and so it's clearly not something they bootstrapped, over the last month or two. Possible, I guess, with the right teams on board to fake it. But my suspicion, so Konami is a company, the major company, when they took a step back from the game industry, I should say from game console.
Yeah, game console. Pachinko they stuck around with.
The console market, right.
Yeah.
Well, they stayed around with arcades in Japan, I believe, at least. I think they did game centers, though they may have sold some of that too at some point. They had games in game centers in Japan. They had pachinko parlors in Japan. That is big money for them. They also have the gyms. Like we have Planet Fitness and Gold's Gym in the U.S. There's Konami gyms in Japan. They were focused on those. Those are money makers for them. The game industry, somewhere like 10-ish years ago, they said we're going to drop away from consoles and put our development efforts and publishing efforts into mobile. And they've seen lots, theoretically lots of mobile stuff. My guess as to why now is very heavily related to likely down quarters these last couple of years. I mean, so if you're looking at their businesses, pachinko parlor, game center, arcades, and gyms, those three businesses require you to be in person in a location, and the pandemic just basically broke 2 years of almost none of that, right? Highly restricted access to that. And people being less excited about sitting and smoking in a parlor for hours and hours, holding a little dial and watching beads move around when, they could just be breathing in the plague. So my suspicion here is that Konami said, well, maybe it's time for us to go back to our war chest and do our IP, our product war chest, and see what can we pull back. They must be aware that there is a desire for Silent Hill content at this point, both with the fan reaction to canceling PT, as well as over the last year or two, there have been almost every 3 to 6 months another rumor about a Silent Hill move or game coming. Which
stirs up a lot of interest and gets a lot of buzz going. So yeah, I think they're probably writing on the wall was showing that there's still a lot of fan interest in seeing Silent Hill turn into something.
I mean 6 months ago or so there was a big is this going to be Silent Hill announcement, and there was it was all based on like a screenshot that someone had leaked. And that turned out to be people thought, attached to the screenshot was Bloober Team. And they were like, oh my God, this is Bloober Team. They do all these horror games. They're going to be doing the new Silent Hill. This is coming from Konami. It wasn't. It was Bloober Team's next game. But, with all of that excitement and just the sheer amount of publicity that type of thing caused, maybe Bloober Team was already in conversations with Konami at that point to do it. If they weren't, then 6 months ago, Konami might have said like, "Whoa, we didn't have anything to do with it. What's with all of this positive, excitement and energy and what's the term? Publicity we're getting for free, right? So tap into that, and that could have been a sign for them to dive in.
Yeah, it could also be that Sony hearing the rumors about them bringing back the second game as like the same way that they've done with Final Fantasy VII and RE. Well, they aren't so much responsible for RE2, but a lot of these like you know PlayStation 2 era revivals that there might have been a real appetite for it, and so Sony might have been leading those conversations and getting something happening. I also think they might have seen an opportunity where if they have had Christoph Gans like saying, "Hey, I want to make another Silent Hill film. This is something that's I would personally enjoy doing." That they were starting to see, hey, if we're going to have two Silent Hill projects in the works, which we're not directly doing ourselves, but we'll have outside studios doing, and we get to profit off of publishing in maybe from the very reasons that you're stating, which is basically, hey, their revenues from their other spots kind of dropped, and now they're looking at, oh, well, we need to start leveraging this stuff, but they already had Sony and Christoph Gans like asking for things. Seeing two Silent Hill projects being revived at the same time might have said, hey, maybe we should ride the wave and get some more projects underway, and we can make a bunch of merchandise and profit off of that as well.
Yeah, let's just hope, I guess, that the products are good. Because boy, would it be a bummer if they came out super rusty for not having made big story-driven games like this for 10 years or so.
I mean, there's no part of this that actually seems like Konami's really going to be involved, and I could be very wrong about this, but I like. We see this in other industries, and we see it in the game industry, where if you're sitting on a big IP war chest that the IP holder has not done anything with, they will start to experiment with going like, hey, well, we'll take on none of the risk. We will give you the IP under some sort of deal. Sony's going to take on a lot of the payments to make sure that Bloober Team has the money to make this happen. And I don't know, may even be doing creative direction, and we'll pay to have the original director and composer come back for this. But the Konami has little skin in the game, but stand to profit as if they can effectively revive the IP. Plus, they'll probably get all the merchandising dollars off of it as well, and it's a win-win for them.
The concern I would have as Konami is that, and I'm sure that they have written in there, we have right of refusal of shipping, of course, right? Where if the game is total crap, they're like, well, we're not going to allow this to be released because it will damage our brand.
Yeah.
But so with that stated, I'm sure they have some costs associated with it, but it's not that much, given, as you pointed out, the deal with Sony and other studios and people attached to it. It sounds like we don't know the details, I should say. It doesn't sound like Konami. I will say this. None of what I've seen in any of the announcements or the journal write-ups or anything like that have said anything particularly like Konami is excited to be a part of this and excited to be doing this. It almost feels to me like Konami's begrudgingly saying, fine, we'll do this.
I mean, the presentation, what they did, the people who spoke about the excitement were the people who were heading up the projects.
Right.
So you got, like, for Silent Hill 2 Remake, they had, the president or, like, creative director at Bloober Team, Sony Relations or PlayStation, first-party relations, them coming out saying how they're excited to support this game, and then the original director and composer coming out on the stage, but no one from Konami directly saying like, this is a really important franchise for us and we really care about it. You never really got that sort of sense from Konami directly.
Yeah. It's overall a little interesting.
It is, and I would hope that the success of this means that Konami takes a look at their franchises and talks about games seriously again.
Yeah.
But if these things fail, I like Castlevania, Metal Gear. What other big Konami classics are there? Contra. There's a couple more. Which
there's a lot of them. We have seen they did Tekken, right? Was that Konami?
No.
Who did that with?
Namco.
Oh yes, you're right. Who didn't they have a fighter? Was it Dead? No,
No,
one
I
that
think
became
Konami
Beach
might have
Ball.
had that's not Altered Beast. There was a game where you would turn into an animal and fight. Uh,
Well, they did
but
Castlevania for one.
yeah, I mean they're big franchises for Castlevania, Metal Gear. I think Klonoa is another one of their games, which is lesser known for certain. Um, uh, those are the games that they
Bomberman.
Bomberman, yeah, but Bomberman's more of a casual game, which I think they've had no problem putting on mobile platforms.
Oh yeah, not at all. Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, for that matter, they haven't had any issue reviving their old classics and just re-releasing them on modern systems. But no remake or anything like that. Just giving it to a team to port over to PlayStation and selling it
That,
out the digital store. So Konami's been very, very hands off. I would hope that the success of one of these might actually get them to seriously consider reviving a lot of their franchises, if not directly developing it, then acting as IP holder and allowing it to be published by other teams. Like in the case of Silent Hill Ascension, like Annapurna will probably get the bulk of the money and will be publisher in function, and then the developer will be no code. So this is one where again they get to be involved and basically be hands off. They just get to profit off of it and benefit from the merchandising. So this is the sort of thing where it's like Konami's not really stepping in as game developer; they're just stepping in as saying, as an IP holder, we are willing to allow our IP to be used to make us money. With the exception of Silent Hill F, which is just very unclear, also seems very, very early, so we don't really know the structure of what that game is going to be.
yeah.
All right, well, any other thoughts about this before we move on?
I think that's about it for me. The last thing I'll say about it is that I was surprised. I was like, wow, that came out of nowhere.
Well, with the exception of Silent Hill Remake, which I think was just very, very heavily rumored and turned out to be exactly what was rumored.
Sure.
Anyways, yeah, let's move on to the second topic. This one's pretty unfortunate. Eric, do you want to recap or do you want me to?
Why don't you do it? I know a little bit less about G. I have less history with G4
Yeah, fair enough.
myself. Yeah.
Well, G4 TV was I guess
Yeah.
a video game channel that had grown out of. Uh, well, it came out of a couple. It started off as Tech TV, and they had their own programming, which eventually rolled over into. I can't remember the name of the company that was between G4. It was like Game something. Um, but this is where we started seeing like Adam Sessler come back or like come on and start running his own show, and that eventually was bought by Comcast, or a company that was eventually bought by Comcast, which turned into G4 TV. G4 TV had a whole series of game centered programming, and they kind of dropped the Tech TV side of things. Tech TV was games plus tech, so they'd cover things like CES and how to fix computers and stuff of that nature. Good content if you were into tech at the time. G4 was started leaning more heavily into entertainment, where they had some pretty interesting show hosts. Things got pretty weird and wacky. But like the core of it was basically X Play, which had Am Sessler and Morgan Webb, and they also had Attack of the Show, which was what's his name,
That was
Kevin
from back in.
Ferreira and Olivia Munn hosting. That show was kind of like a news recap, and uh, X Play was like reviewing games and covering things like E3. So they had a good long run. I think it was probably like 10 years in some form before it was taken off air. And it was taken off air largely because the internet was becoming more important in the way people consume media, especially for a younger generation. And YouTube had sort of eaten G4's lunch, and they couldn't cover content as fast as it was being released to YouTube, especially with companies like, I don't know, Sony, who would normally do things through E3 and then the press would cover it. Sony was now able to release trailers directly and things of that nature. So G4 TV kind of imploded, and I think with the purchase of Comcast, it kind of died. But Jeff Keighley, who was actually part of the G4 TV as well and had his own show, kind of did his own thing. But I think this stirred debate as to whether or not G4 could make a comeback. And I guess after a year of development, in November 2021, Comcast officially relaunched G4. They were able to get Adam Sessler back, which was going to do his own version of X-Play, more YouTube focused, where he was like in a room talking about games. And Attack of the Show came back with Kevin Ferreira and other hosts. The key differences between what they revived with is that it was clearly content focused for the internet consumption, and they had diversified their staff pretty substantially. I think the original stuff they had produced was pretty indicative of what the game industry used to think the game industry was. And then from the time
gamer population,
which was like white male, which I think was a large going perception. But I think as like mobile gaming and a lot of other gaming formats could come out, the demographics were shifting heavily, and people started demanding that, hey, like games should be more representative, like game coverage should be more representative of what the gaming population looks like. Things like E3 shouldn't have scantily clad women walking around. We should be looking at the diversity of what the actual gaming population is. And those things had taken place. So when they revived the show, they went with a more diverse set of people. They weren't going to get the old staff back anyways. Like Olivia Munn has gone off to, I don't know, date comedians and be on her own shows. She's been in a couple movies. And it was like really Adam Sessler and Kevin Ferreira that was part of the old team, and everybody else was new, producing content. I watched quite a bit of it. Getting Adam Sessler's voice back was nice. The other content was okay, but I think that's sort of besides the point. Part of this revival was Russell Aarons, who had been at Machinima, which was a YouTube-focused channel around gaming content, setting up the content for them. And part of like the initial launch was getting it on all streaming platforms on YouTube, and there was supposed to be a move where the content would be played on TV, on Comcast's streaming networks and their cable networks, which, to be fair, probably wasn't a great plan, because I don't know how many like modern gamers are really consuming their content on TV. It really is streaming platforms. So that's the rebirth of the whole thing. Comcast, who has gone under heavy restructuring lately, it pulled the plug on the whole thing and quite abruptly this past week, and like so abruptly, in fact, that people who had assumed they were going to go to work found that they were locked out of all their chat bots and software and whatnot that you'd be using. Any of the systems that the Comcast was using, they were locked out of it, and that was the indication. So they weren't even getting a direct message from the CEO of Comcast. All programming just ceased suddenly. In about, I think, 3 weeks before that, the first like warning shot was the person who's heading up the content, Russell Aarons, was, I don't know, canned, lay off, or just left the as CEO of G4, but no longer creating content. And for like a day, I think they halted all production of content, and they kind of had a like shocked what's going on, and they kind of like unloaded what was happening there, and they were feeling the pressure to create more content more frequently, because already warning shots were being sent by Comcast that were saying, hey, this stuff isn't making the same amount of money that we expect. Although I don't know what you'd expect to build a channel from scratch with the names of just a handful of people within the course of a year. Like, how far could you possibly get in a year to make it like some huge moneymaker for them? But they suddenly pulled the plug on it. In the message from the CEO, which was made public, was basically, we're not profitable, and this is the end of G4. So that was the story of what happened. I think there's more to say, though, in the critical reception of it, which is as often as things happen in the gaming industry and in general fandom, the absolute worst and most toxic voices become the most prevalent for reasons unknown. And they seem to take a real issue with the diversity, and in particular, one of the hosts who was pretty outspoken about the way she was treated and compared to her male colleagues. And then on top of that, her male colleagues who are of color also were making it known that the way they were being received by this fandom was less than great, like getting as far as threats. And we see the same sort of thing with She-Hulk, in which you get like this very toxic fandom, like tearing at the content. Star Wars, whatever, you could name any bit of content that seems to be prevalent in these like geek or traditionally geeky hobbies. But those voices became pretty prominent, very prominent, in fact. And it's unclear whether or not any of this played a part in the immediate discontinuation of G4. But I can't imagine that the Comcast execs, seeing the sort of reception that it was getting by the loudest, most toxic voices, and not responding to it in some way. What is your take on this, Eric, if any take at all?
Yeah, I mean, so from a distance, I think this gets into sort of just business conversation. To an extent. A lot of the, if you're a CEO of Comcast or someone who's looking at the books on Comcast and is seeing a big negative in this sort of niche product that are offering that your overall holding company, because Comcast is huge and has lots of different products. If it's just sucking funds, you're like, okay, well, what you peek under the hood a little bit, and you're like, what's going on in here? And you see that, like you were talking about before, there's all this toxic negativity and everything. If that's your perspective on it, and the person who had been driving and championing it within the company is no longer there, then you're like, well, this is just a negative thing. Like, just axe it, get rid of it. It's just dragging us down in the company. And this, right. So the timing of this, we should also mention, may be related to the fact that we're entering a down market, or we have now been in a down market with high inflation and just not great stock market and available funds. I guess the interest rates are up as well. So there's lots and lots of reasons that people are trying to tighten their belts, and this could be just a belt tightening move for some people at the parent company for G4.
Yeah. I mean, it could be like an austerity measure for certain.
Yep.
I do find it a bit suspicious, like if you're going to spend the money to revive a network, they may have had targets like, we need to have this much attraction and this much sort of, click-through rate and this much attention retention per piece of content we produce. And I think they were definitely going on like a shotgun method, which was produce a lot of content per week, opposed to really high quality content less frequently. They weren't spending a lot of money. The staff in general was quite small. They had maybe it was like five or like 8 hosts, and then they had a small internship staff with production, and they had a production crew. So not by no means a huge costly production for them. They were producing within Comcast studios in LA, so like not their own sound stages or anything like that. So yeah, this whole thing is not exactly like a huge costly budget for them. Presumably they had performance goals to be matching if this is the way that was going to be handled, in that they would have known if they were far underperforming, I would imagine, well ahead of time, because they would be seeing that on a monthly basis, going like, oh, we're well below target. the action of the CEO of G4 being axed abruptly and then the channel being pulled abruptly speaks to some sort of knee-jerk reaction that was not a slow build up to, oh, this channel is not performing the way we want it to, and therefore we have to pull the plug on it. It was either, as you mentioned, like a financial move where they're saying this is really costing us way too much and we do not see continued improvement over the channel, or a stronger backlash to, or reaction to the sort of backlash that the content was getting. And if it's the latter, it's highly unfortunate. And I think it's the sort of thing that fuels the type of people who do this and will sit there and troll on people, and people who are putting in content, trying to make good content, trying to do something of importance, and having people just tear them down repeatedly. It's unfortunate that those voices, whether true or not, see what they want to get out of it.
So influential.
Yeah, it's influential enough to see the whole network go down. And a lot of the claims were like, at least this isn't from Comcast, but from the people who are tearing it down, is that like it had gone too woke, which again, like I'm not sure how is that a derogatory thing to be like, oh, we respect all the type of people who consume games, and opposed to talking about these things in secret, we're going to talk about like the sexism and sort of like the racist behavior, to be quite frank, harassment within the game industry more bluntly, and the people who are doing those sort of things take it to strong offense and then end up doing exactly what they're being called out for, like 10x, and then feel like they get some validation when the network suddenly and quite quickly pulls the plug on the whole thing. Again, none of that's substantiated, but I think that's what is extremely unfortunate, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, the perception, at least from the outside, having that aspect to it is certainly not a good look. And, it's hard to, without knowing exactly the intercompany politics, like who got to make the call to just cut everything off in one go without telling anybody what was coming. I mean, this is more abrupt. It affected way less people, as I understand it, but It was more abrupt than Google cutting Stadia off, right?
Yes.
Stadia,
well, and also Stadia was like, you have 6 months to close everything down,
right?
Or whatever it was.
Right. Stadia Google did not do well by. Well, I think there's something weird about what they did. So Google did not tell their their development partners that they were going to be canceling. Or they were going to shut down the system. So people who were just finishing or in the middle of working on games were not told about this. I think whatever deals they had were getting refunded, or like you just keep the money. There's no, here's all the money we promised you to develop for Stadia. It's like that's the write-off to save a little bit of face. Making this abrupt call.
I mean, in the case of Google, though, like them suddenly pulling the plug, I don't know how you would do that without it leaking ahead of time. Right, I don't know how you'd go out to like hundreds of publishers and developers and being like, "We're pulling the plug on this. You have 6 months, so whatever you're doing."
Yeah, and that's fair. The decision certainly affected a lot more people outside of the company than did G4. I should say development partner, like partners, not just people, because there's a lot of people that watch G4, not enough to float the company, but there are viewers. And those people are affected. And certainly it sounds like it's a handful of a couple dozen people were affected by this. And Comcast, to their credit, claims to be in the leaked memo. They're talking about how their HR will be in touch with staff. We're going to try to find new positions within elsewhere within Comcast. And if we can't find you something, the HR team will be working with you to find something outside of Comcast.
Yeah.
Which is okay, that's great, but it's also, the outcome for the employees, hopefully good, or hopefully good enough, but it's a real bummer.
I mean, it's certainly not an easy place to be within game media, which has been continually shrinking for a while, with the exception of it's basically getting shrunk to the point where it's not really sustainable. And the thing about game media that continues to work well is that individuals who decide to create
Hmm.
YouTube streams or live stream their game behavior is like the thing that's getting the most traction within games media, outside of like, esports.
Yeah,
Um,
it's almost like YouTube today is G4 Tech, if you know the right channels to go to, the
yeah,
right folks to watch. If you have a list of um, channels that content they like, where they cover hardware, what's new in PC, PC parts, and what let's watch people play games or discuss secrets in games or things like that. You can find that on YouTube.
yeah.
So yeah, I think G4, they just saw an opportunity to be like, well, we were the originals, so let's dive in and see if we can
And
tap
honestly,
into
it was
that.
refreshing to hear Adam Sessler talk about games in the eloquent way he typically does. And hearing like the just like a strong set of voices. I think the stuff that didn't work well was like basically like Attack of the Show revivals. Just like it's hard to create a a non relevant show about today's news, and actually have it like succeed,
Yeah.
on YouTube. Like you can't do that when basically you get to choose whoever, irreverent person you want to watch on YouTube. It's more interesting to have something like an experienced voice on subject matter, talk about it in a very reflective way, and having a handful of people be able to contribute to that and talk about things like, either game news or game content itself. But like the other content was this weird. I don't know. They're trying to find some way of attracting viewership to the channel, which I'm not sure they really succeeded in. I don't know what their viewership stats look like, but I don't think they were going well enough for Comcast to ignore the sort of vile commentary on all the content for them not to say like this is just something that we have to pull the plug on. Again, unsubstantiated. Comcast basically said it was financial reasons. It's just the way that they did it, is way more abrupt than you would expect from a decision like that.
Yeah, I just went to the G4 TV channel, and they only have 133,000 subscribers. Not nothing, but
In a
most,
year, right? Like,
yeah, their shows tend to have on the order of X Play looks like between 10 and 50,000 views, and some of the other stuff tends to be somewhere between 5 and 25,000,
yeah,
which that's not a lot in the YouTube view space.
no, but it's also not a little for 1 year of creating content, especially when usually with YouTube it tends to be long legs. Like YouTube, rarely do you make a lot of money up front. You make money over time, and then your content that you've made out of high quality continues to generate income for you. So it becomes a money making machine as long as you're able to continue to create content of the caliber that gets people to watch it. So it's, like YouTube is not the way it used to be, where you could just make a lot of money up front really quickly on just game because you were the one of handful of people creating quality content. Instead, it's tends to be long form, where it's long legs on your content continues to make you money, and it's not really a short-term gain thing. I don't know what the expectations were there,
Yeah, no idea.
because I guarantee
It
you, if you look at
clearly
like X
didn't
Play
match.
stuff a year from now, like the viewership will be doubled or tripled.
As well, as long as they keep sort of advertising it.
Yeah,
Some
or as long as it
I
like
would
keeps
say
coming
that,
up. So yeah,
yeah, some of the stuff, like, well, actually, X Play has 490,000 subscribers. That's a lot better, but still, the numbers of on their videos are of views. A very small percentage of their subscribership watch the videos. It
yeah,
seems, or they cherry pick which videos they want to watch. So yeah,
yeah.
I don't know.
Anyways, all we can really go on is what Comcast has said. I just think it's unfortunate that, whether or not any of the negative, and toxic fandom ship, I guess, had any impact on whether or not Comcast made those decisions. one way or another, it sort of validates the people who are the most toxic and loud in the room, and I really find it discouraging to see that sort of fan base getting the validation that they seek. So we'll see. Anyways, actually, nothing to see there.
I was gonna say, yeah, we saw.
Yeah,
we saw.
I hope Sessler is able to make a career out of it one way or another, though, because Sessler's perspective is good. He gives some pretty interesting perspectives. However, it's written by an entire team and not by himself, so I don't know. Hopefully those writers find more work writing game reviews. Okay. Anyways, let's get to the last topic. Do you want to cover this one, Eric? Because I think you feel like well, I mean, just before this, you were talking about it. So. Yeah.
To recap from last week, Microsoft, the United Kingdom's, the UK, their CMA, which I again forget the name. It's their Consumer Market Authority or something like that. Yep. I don't remember exactly. They put out a statement about the Microsoft buyout of Activision Blizzard.
And as a result of the review, for that matter.
Right. They went through a review period to say, okay, how is this going to affect consumers? How is it going to affect competition specifically? In fact, it may not be consumer, it will be competition in the Markets Authority or something like that. At any rate, that sort of group within the UK came out pretty strongly, at least the write-up they had seems pretty strongly against Microsoft's buyout. They seem to have serious concerns about the fact that Microsoft had basically they owned an OS, Windows, they owned a cloud service, Azure, and they owned a game platform for subscriptions, which was Game Pass. They also had, Microsoft Game Studios or Xbox Game Studios. In dealing with all of this stuff, they came out with basically three, it seemed well-worded, sort of arguments about why they seemed to be recommending that this maybe not go through.
Or that at least go through with some regulations.
Right. They had serious concerns, seemed to be the way that the document was put out there. And it wasn't final. This was sort of an initial draft of what they wanted to do. So fast forward to this week, Microsoft just recently came out with their response to that write-up. And in it was something like a 33-page write-up.
Yeah, it was sizable.
Right. And they claim several things in there. First of all, that Sony has been dominating. This sort of Sony has been, it's weird for Sony to be complaining about this, making themselves out to be the underdog.
Yeah.
When Sony has been at the top of the console games sort of industry for 20 years or so. They've dominated in this space. Microsoft claimed that Sony had sold 151 million. They had a what was it? Was it not an attach rate? They had an installed base. There we go, of 151 million units. Now, presumably that means PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5, possibly even including PlayStation 3. Whereas Xbox,
no, it would be PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 combined.
I guess in total sales, I don't know how they would have come up with the number to say there's you and I both have both. So
yeah, it's like 150 million. I guess your install base would be the 115, 120 million PS4s and the 15, 20 million PS5s.
So they're just combining that.
Yeah, possibly.
So they're saying then that the on the Xbox side, the equivalent era, if they didn't describe the exact consoles, they just threw out numbers, and the number that they said there for the Microsoft side was 63 million Xboxes, and presumably that means the Xbox One generation and the Xbox Series generations, so those two generations. If you include both of those, Sony has over double the install base of Microsoft, And Microsoft, to be fair, has been struggling these last two. I mean, Microsoft was in the lead, at least in certain markets, for a big chunk of the prior generation, PS3 and Xbox 360, with Sony coming back quite late in the game of that generation. Once
Yeah,
they got
I
their
think they held
costs
lead
down.
in marginal lead in the U.S. Well, a long lead in by the U.S. I think they were selling double at one point in time, and then eventually basically found parity as PS3 caught up. Other markets, PlayStation was dominant, but basically I think they end up selling like 80, 90 million Xboxes, 360s of that console generation, if not more. It might have actually went over 100.
Yeah, where the balance came out was Europe and Japan. Japan in particular, they sold very, very few Xboxes, and Sony
Traditionally.
took up the entire generation. Yeah, they did
Yeah.
very well. And then I think in Europe it was roughly 50-50. But the
Yeah.
or at least it was similar to the US in that there was a lead by Xbox and then it caught up.
In
I don't
Europe,
remember
it's kind of moot because it's unimportant.
the way it ended.
The way it ended, the Xbox performed better in Europe. Xbox 360 performed better in Europe during that generation, but the PlayStation always held the lead over it. It was US, which is a sizable market, where the Xbox had held a lead for quite some time, and eventually, towards the end of the generation, the PS3 ended up catching up, mostly due to like the PS3 and name notoriety. Ultimately, the PS3 performed better than the Xbox, but by a much smaller margin compared to say like the PS4 generation.
It was a long fight. It was a long fight for Sony. They had to really get their costs down,
Yep.
to become competitive with the 360. Which, there was also a challenge of the development side, where the PS3 had such a radically different hardware architecture that Sony has even still 2 generations out is struggling to do any sort of emulation on the PS5 for that generation of console. And that's part of what they claim. That's why Microsoft actually has been doing very well on the backwards compatibility aspect of competition with the Xbox. They didn't have that crazy architecture to have to deal with. So anyway, Microsoft is talking about like, well, what are you talking about? We're the underdogs here. We're serious underdogs in terms of installed user base currently. They also claim that Sony has a multi-year agreement with Activision Blizzard, to not allow the Call of Duty title, which that's this whole thing is about, is Call of Duty.
Yeah.
Sony's saying Call of Duty is so big that if we lose it, it's going to be a huge hit to us, and it will affect all the consumers that we have. The game, they will lose that choice and the ability to play that game, without having to then go and get a Game Pass subscription, or buy a Microsoft console or a PC, or I should say a gaming PC. All right, so Microsoft is stating that apparently Sony had a deal with Activision Blizzard to keep the Call of Duty series out of Game Pass for several years, for at least several years, that they wouldn't put it up for that service for I think it was like 3 years or something like that, and that Microsoft said that they were going to be honoring that agreement. So they're saying, look, Sony was doing this sort of anti-competitive thing, and they're the ones who were able to use their market power and market influence to stop that from happening and stop people, the game reaching more audiences, more people. What is Sony even talking about here? And the other main aspect of this was that Sony is a big enough company, in fact, so big that in the time since Microsoft had announced the purchase of Activision Blizzard, Sony had made several strategic investments, and acquisitions of their own. This includes From Software. They have a minor stake in From Software, makers of Elden Ring and other large titles.
Not a controlling stake, it should be
right.
noted.
Non-controlling, right. And the same thing goes for Epic Games.
Yes.
The makers of Fortnite and the Unreal Engine. They've invested in them. They have purchased straight up several studios, including one of the big ones, Bungie, which was responsible for the Halo series, which came out on Microsoft's. In fact, they were sort of a second party studio for Microsoft for quite a while, in fact, possibly a first party studio, and then
they were a first party studio for a while.
Yeah, and they, as an agreement at the end of Halo 4 or something like that, they cut ties with Microsoft and said, we're done. We don't want to do this anymore. And Microsoft said, okay, but we're keeping Halo. So
yeah, well, they were able to keep the IPs, yeah.
Right. And so then Bungie went off and made Destiny and Destiny 2, which are sort of MMO first-person shooters-ish, story-driven-ish games.
Yeah.
At any rate, so Sony has all these things, and Microsoft's like, what do you mean they're the underdog? They're buying stuff left and right. They have the ability to do this. We're not us buying this and them losing. What's it called? Call of Duty is not going to substantially change the fact that or substantially weaken Sony to the point where they won't be able to compete. They're going to leave the market as a result of this. Is sort of their argument, which. Okay, maybe like it's hard to really say what's going to happen, and that's something that we've been sort of saying is like, well, we don't really know. It depends on what people who like Call of Duty do when that disappears from the consoles that they already own and that they already play. The other aspect that Microsoft claimed here, this was actually interesting in their documentation, is that they said that the CMA claimed as one of their 3 recommendations against that Microsoft had the full stack. They had, as in terms of competition, Sony and no other game company at this point can compete with Microsoft because Microsoft owns operating system, game studio, and game hardware, and cloud. They have a cloud infrastructure. It's built out. They have a jump start on everybody else. Whereas, and their argument is, no, Game Center does not run on Azure, which... this seems to be written a bit. So what they're claiming is, and it's a fair point, that at least some of it is a fair point, and I'll get to that in a moment, that the ability to play Xbox Series X titles and all the Xbox titles, in fact, over Game Pass requires that they're being played on Xbox hardware, which is non-standard. That is not something that is offered to anybody on Azure. So they built all of their own infrastructure to be able to play. They have racks of rack-mounted Xboxes that they put together in big, servers that are somehow connected to the games. They have massive game library. They can install them very quickly. Connect them to the game content very quickly so that you, as a player, can go in and say, I want to play that, and within 3 seconds, the game is booting up. This is all infrastructure and hardware that they had to put together. That's fair. Sony has a very similar thing with their PlayStation Now, PlayStation Plus. It used to be PlayStation Now. It was now PlayStation. It's been folded into PlayStation Plus Platinum.
Yes.
Yeah, I guess there's the 2 top tiers of the PlayStation
it's not
Plus.
Platinum. It's Premium or something.
Premium.
Like Plus Premium.
Yeah. There's I don't know. Plus.
Yeah, it's they give some badge to it, but it's PlayStation Plus. It's rolled into the same.
There's
service.
Essentials is the base, and then they have 2 others on top of that. And
PlayStation Plus Premium. I know Premium's another tier, and then Platinum might be. I guess I don't know. Whatever.
Yeah. At any rate, they have. Sony has to have their own rack-mounted hardware for their games to be able to play these things, particularly since PS3 games can be played. As far as we're aware, the only way to play a PlayStation 3 game, other than I think early emulators are starting to hack and crack it, and still have performance problems, but to actually officially play it, and Sony has all the hardware, they're just going to do it this way, is to have a bunch of PlayStation 3s in a rack somewhere. And they bought a company called Gaikai something like 10 years ago to build out the service.
Longer than 10 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, to jumpstart their service. So, actually, 2013, 2012, somewhere around there. At any rate, Microsoft is saying, like, we don't have any benefit from Azure in this. But, what gives me pause there is to think that it's not just the servers that run the content. It's also the backbone. It's the networking infrastructure It's the data centers that you have distributed all over the place, and the CDNs, the content delivery network aspect of this that you need to have. And it's hard for me to believe that Microsoft built a parallel CDN and a completely parallel network that didn't leverage any of the stuff they'd already been doing with Azure
Yeah,
up to
my
that
guess is
point.
that they're being coy with their wording, as
Yeah,
lawyers tend to do, which is to say, no, Azure is a service, and the
right,
service is the software and the content package we give with you, and not the infrastructure and technologies that the infrastructure runs on.
right.
Whereas, I think if you asked any developer, it'd be like, no, I mean it's the software. I mean it's the service, but it's the service that runs on the infrastructure, not just specifically the service. They're probably arguing it the other way, which is, yeah, this is a service, and the infrastructure that we have for this is what um, is what Xbox. I guess whatever it's called, a
Game Path.
Game Pass runs on.
Yeah, yeah,
So much so that Sony's PlayStation Now is running on Azure.
yeah. Or
So
within Azure or something.
within Azure, and they probably worked with Microsoft to create some sort of system that would do this. So they can claim it as much as they want, but if PlayStation Now and what is now PlayStation Plus, you know, premium version, is running on an Azure based system, certainly Xbox's Game Pass is running on at least the infrastructure that runs Azure, but the service side of it is not. And that's how I assume that they delineate. Because
Yeah,
otherwise, I think it's just BS.
right. And to be clear, there's about Sony's use of Azure. Back in 2019, the CEO of Sony said that for many years, Microsoft has been a key business partner for us, though, of course, the two companies have also been competing in some areas. But I believe that our joint development of future cloud solutions will contribute greatly to the advancement of interactive content. How is it? I mean, and that's where they were announcing the partnership to bring PlayStation Now into Azure as the development. How are you going to argue that your competitor, who you're trying to argue against here, uses your service and you don't? Like, there's not
Yeah.
any of that infrastructure that they clearly are making use of, even though they also have to have custom hardware in that installed in there for that to work.
Yeah, it's on specific definitions that you have to ask to be like, what? How exactly are you defining Azure then?
Right.
And that's the only
Right.
way you'd find out that like their wording has been funny.
Yeah. So, yeah. What do you think about the statements? Do they hold water, or is this sort of more of a just throw up a smokescreen,
I mean, it's certainly a smokescreen.
legal smokescreen?
It's a legal smokescreen because I
Yeah.
think what the CMA had expressed, whether or not they had enough validation or evidence to back up their claims,
Hmm.
wasn't wrong, and I don't think Microsoft has a good argument against this. So what they chose to argue for in their sort of rebuttal was less about the content of what was being argued, but by throwing chaff. Right? It's just going, well, what about this? Like, we're the underdogs. If you only include the PS4 generation and this very short year and a half, 2 years of Xbox, or like Xbox Series PS5 generation,
Hmm.
but ignore the ignore the PS3 generation or in like Xbox 360 generations. You're like, well, first of all, you're being very specific about what data you're choosing, because if you looked at just
Yeah.
the Xbox Series and the PS5, you'd probably find not that sort of 2x uh,
No. No.
divide between the console sales. Um,
Right.
and you could even argue that those numbers indicate that their Xbox Game Pass service may even be driving console sales better than it did during the or than just the console offering did for the um, Xbox not
One.
series Xbox One generation. Yeah.
Yeah. Ugh.
So like arguments like that, I think are BS. Like
Yeah.
it's being very specific about how they word things to create a counter argument that doesn't directly address the content of the CMA's specific issues. or arguing that like console sales are what matter when in fact you're not like this whole acquisition isn't about console sales. It's about expanding a platform, acquiring IP, so that you can own that IP and decide how you're going to distribute that in the future. Whereas I would even go as far as to argue that Sony's acquisition of IPs this is the same thing I said last week, is that Sony's acquisition of IPs is not about really IP acquisitions, more about talent. So they buy studios for the talent and not IP. The exception to that is Bungie and the success of Destiny. But even within that contract, Destiny has the ability to usurp any content. Like when it comes to Destiny, usurp creative decision making and business decision making over Sony. And Sony specifically said, we're not going to be making
We don't want
this.
to.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
For the same reason, I'd argue Microsoft would not consider taking Call of Duty Warzone and making that console exclusive, because the whole reason why that game works as well as it does is because of the large player base they get from Sony consoles and Microsoft consoles.
Yeah, I mean, and we've said that before, that it would behoove Microsoft, I mean, on a pure numbers basis. It would, if you're looking at it and saying, well, this company, Activision Blizzard, makes a ton of money, and we can justify the fact that we're spending $69 billion because we'll make that money back in 4 or 5 years, and then everything after that is just profit. It goes into our coffers and we can invest it back in whatever, right? Cool. But
well,
you're 60.
It would take a lot more than that. Right now,
Yes.
it's like 60 years.
Right. But so on top of that, you're looking at it and saying, well, we're also going to cut out, if you believe Sony's or Microsoft's statement there with the numbers, and you say 60 million to 150 million, we're going to take 3/4 of the user base and stop selling to them.
Yeah.
Now, Microsoft's goal there is to increase that 60 million and say, well, if we even get half of the number of users over there, that's substantial for us. That expands our user base a lot. And maybe they're able to do that because instead of requiring that people buy consoles, they just use their computer and are just subscribing to the service. And that's what they want. So, yeah, maybe, but it seems sort of silly that you're going to shut that down. It make more sense to have at least a transition period where you have that enabled and you start inviting people in and getting the subscribership up and prove that it works. Like Call of Duty is a pretty twitchy style game, and people work their behinds off to get their ping down and make sure that they have very responsive server connections to make sure that they can be competitive online. And if you're doing the round tripping to the server to get the controls, like that just is going to reduce your effectiveness on that as well. So whether or not a Twitch-ish style game like in a highly competitive game like online Call of Duty would make sense in Game Pass, that's another question that hasn't really been addressed. But Microsoft, I think, is that. I think that my personal opinion looking at this is that they are interested in going the path of, we just want to increase the amount of content that Game Pass has so we can own that.
Right.
Which
has been
the
their MO for quite
solution.
some time. Right? Like,
right.
We shouldn't forget that Microsoft is the one that started the buying exclusivity deals on what was originally content that was available on multiple consoles, so it would be locked up on one console, right? They did this with Tomb Raider. They did this with a couple other games, which caused Sony in the PS4 generation to respond and be like, we're locking down the biggest games. We'll throw a ton of money at it to get that to happen, which led to Call of Duty not being exclusive, but getting exclusive content and being exclusively like advertised on the PlayStation 4 during the Call of Duty era in that generation. So it's like, I think they're talking out like both sides of their mouth, and they're doing so in a way that is not being honest about what the actual situation is. Like owning this content, owning the IPs that were cross console at one point, and being able to leverage that to get people to use your service because it's going to be the only way you can access content that you were able to previously enjoy across multiple channels, is A, not a good thing for the game industry as a whole, and B, like the entire point of Microsoft wanting to buy Activision for $69 billion, in increasing the value that it
Yeah.
was valued at the time that the purchase was made. Because I think at the time it was like 52 billion was the market cap for it, and they offered 69 billion, so they went well over the value of the company to make the acquisition. Like stuff like that. It's like these things don't add up. So the argument that they're making, I think, is pretty disingenuous for what the actual intentions are.
Yeah, I mean, for more evidence, they claim in their they claim in their document that like, oh, Microsoft has in the same basically this I think it's the same paragraph where they describe we we are dead last in the console space. They say also we have no presence in mobile. But them buying Activision Blizzard would get them King, which is very large in mobile. They're one of the biggest companies in mobile. So that would immediately also ramp up their mobile presence in the console industry. So for them, this is, I mean, it makes also, with Blizzard, you get Diablo, World of Warcraft, Overwatch, Heroes of the Storm, tons of huge titles that are generally PC
Guitar
and
Hero.
have been making. What's that?
Guitar Hero.
Yeah, is that the Activision?
Yeah, exactly. It's under Activision.
Yeah, so you get so some of these other titles that are just let alone Guitar Hero, but they have the ability to then command what's going on with all these other ones, and it's like, okay,
Yeah, and I think their argument would hold more water if they were just like we only bought Activision, and this was our first major acquisition because we think it's strategically important, which is really the point of it. But they had also purchased another large publisher, which is Bethesda, prior to that. So now, not only are they a big publisher in their own right, but because of the past acquisitions of IP and developers that they had done since the Xbox One the original Xbox generation. But now Bethesda, which holds Elder Scrolls, which is stupidly large on PC and did very, very well on console, Fallout, plus anything that the guys over at what's the name of them? The guys who did Dishonored and
Arcane Studios.
Arcane, thank you. Yeah, as well as them, which are not quite as popular but very solid games. They also got id Software with Doom and Quake and all those. So it's like, yeah, it's not a small purchase they've been making over these past couple of years. And the fact of the matter is they've made no promise, with the exception of honoring Call of Duty, to say that any of those titles will make it cross-console. I'm not sure if it's in their best interest to say take something like Elder Scrolls and make it console exclusive, but certainly it benefits them and strategically makes sense that they would not allow it on any other streaming platform. It would only be on Xbox Game Pass, and I think in the short term, it would behoove them to use that as leverage to prevent, and not publish it on Sony, to get people to move over to Game Pass. And once they have their ownership up and physical media starting to die, that's when they can entertain putting things back on physical media on other consoles again.
Yeah.
But I find the whole argument that they're making is pretty disingenuous. Is it fair or not to hold Microsoft to a different standard than Sony when it comes to these acquisitions? Maybe not, but the scale at which Microsoft is doing it is by far and away much larger than what Sony's doing.
It really seems to be a game of who can make themselves out to be the weaker.
Yeah,
Which is the opposite. It's the opposite of what you see in the markets. But in this case, everyone's like, no, I'm the small, fragile thing that's going to die if this happens, or if this doesn't happen. Like, this only is helping me. I'm so far behind.
Yeah,
I have to spend more money than anybody else on this. And I can. It's like a line item for me. It's fine.
And Sony, Sony doesn't have an argument there. Like, Sony is like
Huge
huge, right? Like
in the
they've
industry.
managed to
Yeah.
be on top of the console pile,
Yep.
you know,
For a
three
while.
generations in a row. Arguably the PS4 generation, maybe not, because the Wii is, I think, just like a hair away from outperforming it, or already has
Yeah.
outperformed it. But regardless, like it's weird to compare those two because the
They
Switch
were
is like,
different. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. The Switch, Nintendo has been going there. They made in actually the PS3 generation and the Wii. They made their Red Sea Blue Sea or Red Ocean Blue Ocean argument, and they were like, we can't compete with the graphics. We tried that through GameCube, and clearly we didn't succeed. In terms of who's got the most bits of graphics and whatever, trying to
not
track
to
people.
mention
That's
that they
not
just didn't have other companies to float
well.
to make
That was the
massive
yeah.
investments in hardware development.
Right. No, that's exactly right. They were very limited in what they could do. So they said, well, okay, if hardware isn't our big thing, what is? And they said, well, we do very well in mobile, and we have very creative teams. So what can we do to maybe reach a new audience? And that was what brought the Wii around.
Yeah,
And that sort of went to the Wii U, where they were like, what if we could do something like our highly successful Nintendo DS, but also sort of with the Wii, sort of maybe? And that was just weird. No one did. That
yeah.
was the Wii U. And then the Switch, they were like, what if we just combine the Switch
That
and
took all the games we
the
developed for
DS?
the Wii U and brought them to this other platform.
Yeah, yeah. And some of our
It
DS
only
games.
published two of our own major titles this console generation.
Yep.
Which I think is kind of funny because they basically like they waffle back and forth between like the Wii was kind of a weak console generation for game
Weak.
publishing. Like
Yeah.
they had some pretty big titles, but they focused very much on these casual market and not on the
Oh, yeah.
hardcore games. And then the Wii U came out, they're like, actually, we're going to make hardcore games, and no one bought the Wii U, so they published a bunch of these great titles that no one played. And so they're like, okay, time for the Switch. They did Mario Odyssey and Zelda Breath of the Wild.
Yep.
And then after that, they're just like, why do we need to when we have all these games in our back catalog that no one ever played?
I mean, to be fair to Nintendo, they did a Kirby game, they've done an Animal Crossing, they're doing Pikmin, they've been going back. They did Smash Brothers. They actually did Smash Brothers for Wii U and Switch. That's like the one that I guess in Zelda. I think Zelda they had Skyward Sword, which I think did have a Wii U release, and Breath of the Wild was Wii U as well.
Yes.
That was a cross gen.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it wasn't nothing, but they've definitely
No,
had
but like they scaled back the type of, because usually like in prior generations you get like two Mario games, two Zelda games, that sort of thing, and they kind of like rolled back to being much slower in the rollout and instead putting focus on their like B tier titles. Although at this point, Animal Crossing proved that it's not a B tier title. So
yeah, that one blew everybody out of the water. All their games, they're like, yeah, Animal Crossing, everybody wants it. Like, okay.
Yeah. Well, like, but going back to the point, I guess, is like,
Sure.
each company had to find like a different way. Like, but it's like, yeah, Sony's proven that they can really own this market, the console market, and produce high quality software of their own IP. And Nintendo's proven that, hey, if we do things differently, we'll use our software to create our own IP and come in at a different price point, come in with our different software and have a different sort of sell advantage. And Microsoft managed to trash so many of its studios that it purchased early on. And it kind of fell apart with the Series Xbox One generation that and like the sales were just miserable for that entire generation, that they had almost given up gaming. And then they said, actually, we're going to pivot because they said, and a good hypothesis here, which is, what if gaming didn't require a $400 to $500 investment to start playing? And I think, blowing that open and opening up streaming and being the king of streaming will allow them to be competitive in a way that they haven't been able to in the console market. And with this sort of hoarding of IPs, will allow them to be more than successful in this space and possibly totally upend the entire industry in a way that would be unrecoverable for Sony and Nintendo. Would both see like significant losses in their ability to make money on physical hardware and software sales. they would
Yeah.
both have to probably either become much smaller companies or pivot in a way that is sort of unprecedented. Anyways,
Yep.
that's all I've got. Any other thoughts before we close up?
No, I think it'll be interesting to see if the CMA in the future, we'll watch the space, but what will the CMA say, and will they adjust their will they produce a new draft that responds to these arguments, or provides so one of the things real quick that that Microsoft's response claimed was that many of the statements put forth by the CMA, which by the way is Competition and Markets Authority, they claim Microsoft's in their rebuttal claimed that the CMA was using novel arguments, like unprecedented novel arguments in their language, and that which to an extent makes sense. Microsoft was also arguing at the same time. I say to an extent makes sense. This is where I'm going to argue against that, or I'll say I'll qualify that. Microsoft said this is unprecedented. There's nothing like this in the books, and they also claim that the game streaming market is nascent. It's brand new. It's never been done before, which isn't exactly true, because Gaikai existed back over 10 years ago, or 10 plus years ago. Sony bought it and started PlayStation Now. PlayStation Now, which is now part of PlayStation Plus, has been around for ages. Microsoft themselves, Stadia came and is going. It's already been a few years up and down, and like Microsoft's Game Pass has been around for a little bit now. So to argue that this is brand new, like no one's else, but also to argue they're using new arguments against this is like, well, you can't claim that it's a new industry or that it's a new market segment or new market, and then also be mad at them that there's unprecedented arguments, because if this is a totally new thing, where do you pull your precedents from?
Right.
There's this may be an unprecedented event, at least at this scale. And that's something, it is certainly unprecedented for the game industry. Nothing on this scale has happened in the games industry before. So it's sort of, Microsoft seems to me trying to have their cake and eat it too in this space. They're lawyers.
Absolutely.
They also claim, the other point I was going to point out was that the CMA doesn't provide proof or evidence that about the arguments that they put forth, which that may be one of the things that a rebuttal from the CMA, they go in and add footnotes or
the final report, like whatever their final decision is. I would imagine, given that they are probably an entire organization of business and market analysts, that they will have plenty of proof to come up with, because it's like lawyers versus business analysts that are saying, hey, your business is going to be anti-competitive in nature.
Yeah, we did our homework.
Yeah,
the proof. We just didn't show you that in our first draft, because we expect to change it. So yeah, who knows? The Microsoft. So we'll see. It'll be interesting to see what comes of this. Again, I suspect that in the end it will probably go through, but the back and forth is revealing in many ways, both about how the businesses operate, both Sony and Microsoft, the game industry operates, and what's at stake to an extent, in terms of how these things are going to develop going forward. And we'll be interested to see what the European Union says.
And the U.S. For that matter, like whether or not they take a cue from what the EU is doing. Because I think we're coming into a point where we've been very, very unregulated in the way we've handled large businesses and acquisitions, in their acquisitions, and we're beginning to see a lot of changes in the way that the people who regulate these sort of things are viewing it and viewing the negative impact it's had on economies. Arguably a very negative impact, because it's now like economies are less diversified and rely on the success of large companies to not collapse, and it's never been proven that the bigger the company gets, the less likely they are to fall. It's like they may not fail as often, but when they fail hard. So we may be seeing more pushback against that, pushback against Microsoft, and pushback against burgeoning industries from becoming totally dominated by just a handful of players and it becoming fundamentally non-competitive. Anyways, I think that wraps it up for today. If you sat through this and listened to us ramble on for a couple hours, thank you. If you like this type of content, like the content, subscribe to get notifications when we're going to go live again. Next week we will not be live, but we will probably the following week after that. So hopefully we'll see you then. And thanks for watching, everybody.
Yeah.